Introduction. Who I am. My name is Jessica Miller, and I'm a 30-year-old high school English teacher, living in the quiet suburbs of Portland, Oregon. From the moment I walked into my first classroom, fresh out of college, I knew teaching was what I was meant to do. I love the way literature sparks conversations and helps students open up about their dreams, fears, and identities. There's a certain magic in seeing a student's eyes light up when they finally understand a challenging poem or find their voice in an essay. I grew up in a small coastal town called Rockport, raised by parents who were both teachers themselves. My childhood wasn't full of luxuries, but it was rich in stories, books, and dinner table debate. My parents always believed education was the key to transformation, and they passed that conviction on to me. I was encouraged to question, to learn, to stand up for what I believed in, even when it made me different from others. After earning my master's degree at the University of Oregon, I decided to stay close to home and applied for a position at Maplewood High. It was a tight-knit community where everyone seemed to know each other. Over the past 7 years, I'd built close relationships with students and faculty alike. People around me often say I have a calm presence and a patient ear for anyone who needs it, a reputation I hope to continue earning every day. I'm a bit of a bookworm. My weekends are often spent curled up in my favorite coffee shop with a new novel, or hiking in the lush Oregon forests,
It's the same
clearing
case.
my mind after
was
a
never
long week
closed.
of grading papers. To balance the stress of teaching, I practice yoga and run with my rescue dog, Marley, who has an endless supply of energy. Outside of the classroom, I take pride in volunteering with the school's theater department and leading the creative writing club. Nothing brings me more joy than watching a shy freshman read their poem aloud for the first time, or helping seniors craft college essays that show who they are beyond test scores. My friends would probably describe me as loyal, determined, and maybe a little stubborn when I believe in something. I try to see the good in people.
I'm telling the truth. I had nothing to
sometimes
do
a
with
fault.
this. You have to believe
That's why
me.
betrayal cuts so much deeper when it comes from someone I trust. I believe that every teacher faces their own struggles, difficult students, heavy workloads, moments of doubt. But in a small school like Maplewood, the faculty becomes your second family. I'd grown particularly close to another teacher, Emily Parker, who started at Maplewood around the same time as me. We'd shared lunches, lesson plans, even family holidays. I considered her my confidant. We were often seen together, finishing each other's sentences and supporting each other through the ups and downs of teaching. Looking back now, I realize how much my identity and happiness were tied not just to my work, but to the relationships I built there.
Yeah, we're
My
still
trust in
processing the
others,
scene. I'll advise when we're done
especially
here.
Emily, would become both my strength and my greatest vulnerability. In this place, where I'd hoped to grow roots and make a difference, a secret betrayal lurked just beneath the surface, one that would challenge everything I thought I knew about friendship, loyalty, and my own resilience.
Hey,
The
watch where
first
you're going.
seeds
He
of
just
doubt.
took off.
I remember the very first hint that
Stop right
something
there.
was off, almost like a cold wind blowing
the
through an
drop
open
point.
window, subtle
You have less than an
but
hour
impossible
before they
to
move
ignore.
everything.
It was late January, just as Seattle's endless drizzle was giving way to the optimistic possibility of spring. Our principal had recently announced plans to promote a teacher to department head, a position I'd quietly hoped for since my second year at Cedar Springs. It's the kind of role that doesn't just come with a bigger paycheck or a nicer parking spot. It's a sign of trust, a real seat at the table where decisions are made. I felt ready for the opportunity. My track record was good, my reviews strong, and several
The evidence
colleagues
clearly
had encouraged
shows
me
that the
to
defendant
apply.
was aware of
For
the
weeks,
structural flaws
I allowed
before the
myself
sale.
small daydreams, imagining how I'd overhaul the curriculum, mentor new teachers, and champion marginalized students. I started preparing little notes
Smith,
and proposals,
I need you
even
to tell
jotting
me
down
exactly what
ideas
you
on
saw.
napkins between lunchroom duties. I shared
And
some
you
of
are
these
absolutely
plans with
certain he
Rachel
was with
over
you the
coffee,
entire afternoon.
and she
Yes,
seemed
we were
excited,
collaborating on the
supportive,
curriculum in my
as
classroom until
always.
at least 5.
But without warning, tiny cracks started to grow in my mostly steady routine. First, there were the hallway whispers. A couple of colleagues who used to greet me warmly now seemed guarded, like they had a secret they couldn't share. At department meetings, I'd catch glances exchanged around the table, quick, uneasy, as if my presence had become awkward. There was suddenly a strange formality when people spoke to me, as if they were following a script. I dismissed it at first, blaming the usual stress of mid-year grading, or maybe just my own paranoia. Still, the feeling grew harder to ignore. The real blow came one stormy Thursday afternoon when Mr. Graham, one of the longest-serving teachers, asked if I could speak to him privately after school. He closed the door behind us, his voice low and serious. "Amanda," he said, "I don't want to alarm you, but there have been some concerns brought to the administration about your interactions with students." I felt my heart stutter. "Concerns?" I echoed, barely keeping my voice steady. He was vague. There were whispers
We know
about
you're
me
lying.
being too
It's time
informal,
to confess.
not upholding
sorry.
professional boundaries,
I did it.
letting
I'm so
students get
sorry.
away with too much. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had always prided myself on the trust I built with my students. That was my strength, not a weakness. As I thanked Mr. Graham and left, my mind spun with questions. Who could possibly say such things about me? What had I done to earn this kind of suspicion? That evening, I lay awake replaying every moment of the past semester, searching for clues in casual conversations, emails, student comments, anything that might have been misinterpreted. It was the first time in my teaching career that I felt genuinely unsafe and unseen in my own school. The next morning, after a sleepless night, I stared into the bathroom mirror and promised myself I'd get to the bottom of it. If I was being accused, I needed to find out why and who was behind it. That was the moment doubt took root, and it would change everything about the world I thought I knew. The shock of betrayal from someone close. No one ever expects the knife in their back to bear the fingerprints of a friend. Trust, I've always believed, is a choice we make every day, a deliberate leap of faith, especially with those who know us best. Sometimes, I think the hardest lessons in life are the ones that teach us just how fragile that trust truly is. The day I learned where the rumors came from still echoes in my memory, like a cold wind slamming a door shut. Everything had been swirling inside me for weeks, a half-whispered sense of dread, the mounting tension at work, the fear that my career was slipping through my fingers because of something I couldn't quite name. I was holding myself together with the quiet hope that, soon enough, the truth would come out and the haze would lift. I wanted desperately to believe that my relationships, especially the one with Emily, were unchanged. After all, we were the dynamic duo at Brookside, the English and history teachers who finished each other's sentences and brought bagels for the whole staff on Friday mornings. But secrets have a way of creeping through cracks, and one rainy Monday afternoon, everything came tumbling down. It started innocently enough. I was gathering my books after 7th period when Caitlin, a new math teacher, who always lingered at the edge of faculty gossip, asked if I had a minute. Her voice trembled as she closed the classroom door behind her. "Lauren, I think you deserve to know." She hesitated, wringing her hands. "People are saying things about you meeting with students alone. And, well, Emily's been vocal about it. She's the one who brought it to Mrs. Evans last month." I felt my breath catch in my chest. For a moment, the world held perfectly still. I looked at Caitlin, half expecting her to suddenly laugh and say she was joking, but the sadness in her eyes told me this was real. Emily, my best friend, the person I laughed with over burnt coffee and cried with when lesson plans went awry. I thanked Caitlin quietly and sat down at the edge of my desk, every ounce of strength draining from my body. My mind spun back to dozens of conversations with Emily. Late-night texts, venting sessions, the way she'd encouraged me to apply for department chair. Had it all been a lie? For days, I walked around in a fog. I replayed every memory, like a detective analyzing crime scene footage. Had I missed the jealous edge in her encouragement, the hollow cheer in her laughter? I started to remember little things, moments I'd brushed off. The time Emily asked about my plans for the department, her pointed questions about how I connected with students, even her sly jokes about my open-door teaching policy now took on a sharp, unpleasant meaning. Emotions churned inside me: disbelief, sadness, and, eventually, a simmering anger. I wanted to confront her, to scream and ask her why, but when I imagined her face, I saw not just the betrayer, but the friend I'd loved. That hurt more than anything the rumors could have done. I remembered my mother's words, spoken after a childhood disappointment. The people closest to us can hurt us most, but that doesn't mean you should let them steal your spark. Those words became my lifeline. I started to quietly observe Emily, training myself to see through the old lens of friendship and take in every new detail. She seemed more hurried these days, always glancing over her shoulder and working late, even when she had no papers to grade. Our once effortless conversations felt stilted, almost rehearsed. I caught her on more than one occasion, exchanging quick, sharp words with Mrs. Evans or ducking into the copy room the moment I walked down the hall. Meanwhile, the pressure at school increased. I was called in for more meetings, where vague accusations floated around me like gnats. Hard to swat, impossible to ignore. More staff members pulled away, as if my reputation were contagious. Students noticed, too. A few asked why the classroom felt tense or why I seemed distracted. And I had to keep my pain bottled up, determined not to let my troubles spill into their learning. It was during this time that I discovered the true depth of Emily's betrayal. I stumbled across a half-finished email on the shared staff computer, left open in the rush between classes. It was drafted by Emily, addressed to Mrs. Evans, and filled with careful, damning language, suggestions that I blurred boundaries, that I manipulated student trust for my own professional benefit. There was nothing specific, nothing that proved wrongdoing, but it hurt all the same. It was worse that it came from someone who knew my teaching style so intimately, who could tailor her doubts to match my deepest vulnerabilities. I felt my world wobbling. I'd been careful, always professional, never crossing a line with students or colleagues. But reading her words, it was like a mirror, shattering. If my best friend believed these things, or was willing to lie that she did, was anything I'd known real? The sense of shame was almost overwhelming. Instead of lashing out, I made a choice. I would fight for myself, not with anger, but with clarity and truth. I started keeping records, documenting emails, taking notes during every meeting, and confiding in a small circle of trusted teachers who had known me long before Emily arrived. Every day, forced myself to be present, kind, and strong for my students, even as I felt hollowed out inside. The betrayal had left a scar, but I refused to let it become my whole story. Looking back, the hardest part wasn't losing the promotion or being the subject of gossip. It was seeing my friendship with Emily unravel thread by thread, knowing that she'd chosen ambition or maybe insecurity, over loyalty. In those dark days, I realized that sometimes surviving betrayal isn't about getting justice or winning back what you've lost. Sometimes it's about holding on to your own sense of self when the world around you tries to rewrite your story. And though I didn't know it yet, this experience would force me to find a resilience I'd never guessed I had. The decision to investigate. Making the decision to investigate what had happened at Willow Creek High wasn't instantaneous. In fact, it was one of the hardest calls I'd ever had to make. Not just because it meant facing down someone I'd once called my friend, but because it forced me to question the very foundation of my identity as a teacher, a colleague, and above all, a trusting human being. The first days, after I realized Karen's potential involvement, passed in a haze of disbelief and stubborn hope that perhaps new evidence would point in another direction. I tried to convince myself it was all a misunderstanding, an unfortunate confluence of events, a case of administrative confusion. But every new anomaly, every whisper in the staff room, every inexplicable document left in my mailbox pointed toward something more deliberate, something that couldn't simply be chalked up to office gossip or paperwork gone astray. I spent hours reviewing every email, every text message, every digital footprint I could find. The evidence was mounting, but it was circumstantial. The accusations against me had become more specific, their timing too convenient. Late parent responses, sudden complaints from students who had never before mentioned a problem, all followed a pattern that aligned with moments when Karen and I weren't speaking, days when she had picked up my classes while I was at a workshop, or times when she'd helpfully offered to organize my paperwork during a late-night grading marathon. Late on a Sunday evening, I sat at my kitchen table, journals and lesson plans splayed all around me, a cup of tea growing cold at my elbow. I stared at my reflection in the living room window. I saw exhaustion, but beneath it, a steely glint. It was then I realized I could either let Karen get away with sabotaging my career, or I could fight to clear my name and reclaim my self-respect. So I decided to launch my own investigation, not with anger, but with resolve. I knew it would be risky, not just professionally, but emotionally. If I got it wrong, if I accused someone without evidence, I'd risk more than my job. But if I succeeded, I could expose the truth and ensure that no one else would fall victim to this betrayal. My process began with documentation. I started creating detailed logs of every questionable incident. I stored every email, sent, received, deleted, cross-referencing dates and times. I created backup copies of lesson plans and password-protected files that only I could access. I became meticulous, bordering on obsessive, jotting down who was present in staff meetings, which teachers had access to shared resources, and cataloging every interaction I had with Karen. Next, I reached out to a few trusted colleagues, people with no ties to Karen, under the pretense of double-checking records for a school administrative review. "Have you ever received any late parent communication from me?" I asked, as nonchalantly as possible. I compared notes with those who'd covered my classes, probing for inconsistencies without revealing my suspicions. I began setting subtle traps, not out of malice, but as a way to pinpoint the leak. Every document I shared, every email I sent, I tracked who received it and who could access it. Each time, when a new accusation surfaced, I looked back at my logs and found the pattern. Only materials Karen had handled seemed to go missing or be altered. The web of her involvement grew more blatant the closer I looked. Yet the hardest part wasn't the number crunching or the digital forensics. It was maintaining composure. Each day, While teaching Macbeth or moderating a classroom debate, I had to appear unruffled. My students deserved the best of me. They couldn't be made to bear the burden of staff drama. The hours after school were my battleground, spent in the soft glow of my desk lamp, piecing together the puzzle. I even reached out to my older brother, a paralegal, for advice, careful to frame my questions as hypotheticals. What would you do if you thought someone at work was misrepresenting your actions? He stressed the importance of clear, impartial records and reminded me that people and organizations often believe the loudest voice, not the truest. Let the evidence speak for itself, he said. Determined to face the school board with undeniable proof, I embraced technology as my silent witness, archiving digital logs, installing re-ed receipts, screenshotting every relevant message. I carried a small notebook everywhere. I became my own investigator, chasing truth through the labyrinth of bureaucracy and betrayal. Perhaps the most discouraging realization came when I saw just how clever Karen truly was. Her efforts weren't clumsy or obvious. They were careful, hidden behind a mask of helpfulness and camaraderie that had blinded me for months. That knowledge stung, but it also steeled my resolve. What had begun as an act of self-defense turned into a crusade for justice, not just for me, but for every teacher who'd been targeted by manipulation. With each new piece of evidence, my confusion gave way to clarity. I felt a kind of power I'd rarely known, the strength that comes from knowing you're fighting not only for yourself, but for what's right. And so, with every lesson plan, every archived email, every scribbled note, I built my case and prepared for the confrontation that would change everything. The truth revealed in the meeting. The morning of the board meeting arrived, and I could barely sleep the night before. I remember staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with everything I'd compiled and practiced. The stakes had never felt higher. My reputation, career, and self-worth were all teetering on the edge. But beneath the anxiety, there was a thread of steel running through me now. I'd come too far, gathered too many receipts, and witnessed too much sabotage to turn back. I got to school early that day, earlier than even the janitorial crew. Sitting alone in my classroom, I rehearsed my points, sorting stacks of paper, printouts, and notes into neat piles. There was anticipation in the air, a hush before a storm. I went over my opening, the phrases I'd carefully chosen so my voice wouldn't shake. Notes, evidence logs, emails. My legal pads looked like the work of a true detective at this point. Even though my hands trembled, my conviction did not. Sometime around 8 a.m., my principal, Mrs. Randall, knocked on my door. She had always been brisk and professional, with a face that rarely betrayed emotion one way or another. She let me know the meeting would start promptly, at 9. As she walked away, I realized this wasn't just about defending myself. This was about restoring trust, not only among my colleagues, but within myself. When I stepped into the conference room, there was a chill. Members of the school board, the principal, and several faculty were present. Karen, her face unreadable, sat toward one end of the table, shuffling the hem of her cardigan, her eyes fixed somewhere over my shoulder. That image is still burned into my memory. The room heavy with expectation, the sound of shuffling papers, the uneasy shifting in seats. The meeting began with Mrs. Randall reading the agenda aloud. Allegations of unprofessional conduct concerning Ms. Sarah Martin. I tried to keep my expression calm. Let them see someone calm, collected, and unjustly accused, I told myself. Karen spoke first, reiterating her concerns in guarded, formal language. She recounted instances of inconsistency in my communication with parents, implied that I was careless with grading, and even hinted there had been complaints from students about favoritism. As she talked, her voice was controlled, playing the role of a concerned colleague. For anyone unfamiliar with our history, she sounded almost reasonable, but I had grown wise over these last few months. I recognized each seed of doubt she planted, the artful ambiguity, never a concrete accusation, always just enough smoke to cast suspicion without fire. When it was my turn, my voice was steady. I had rehearsed exactly how to present my evidence, not as a wounded friend, but as a professional. I spread out my documentation, color-coded emails, dated notes, copies of lesson plans, and records of every odd occurrence, all meticulously linked to incidents Karen could have influenced. I presented a timeline of communications, pointing out discrepancies only possible if someone had tampered with my files or misrepresented my messages. I handed out copies of emails that had been altered, ones I had sent and backed up in my private drive, and ones Karen forwarded to the administration with suspect edits. I explained how I tracked the document history, showing definitive proof that someone with her login credentials had accessed, downloaded, and changed my files late at night on several occasions. When I was at home and logged off, eyes around the table widened as I handed over the technological audit. I could see the board members were unprepared for this level of detail. Mrs. Randall leaned in, examining a highlighted printout, as if seeing Karen for the first time. When the issue of parent complaints came up, I calmly referenced my communication logs, printed copies of every email I'd sent and received, plus the raw timestamps. I explained my cross-checking process, questionnaires shared with trusted colleagues who had substituted my classes, verifying that I hadn't missed emails or left issues unaddressed. I recounted my careful process of logging every meeting, phone call, and conversation, making it clear how impossible the allegations were when scrutinized side by side against reality. A board member asked if I could prove Karen had been the source of the altered messages. I presented logs that showed which school computers had been used, explaining how I'd set up digital watermarks and monitored IP access to my files after my suspicions grew. There was even a day when Karen was in the building during a snow delay and had logged in, forging a time-sensitive report from my email that later triggered more accusations. At this point, I felt my story, the real story, coalesce from the jumble of notes and sleepless nights. It was as though a silent film played for the board, each puzzle piece clicking into place. I clarified that my intention wasn't to destroy Karen, but to show the pattern of manipulation and restore my honor. My voice nearly broke at that moment, but I dug deep for courage. No one interrupted. I think everyone in the room realized just how much this had cost me. The hours of labor, the toll of betrayal, the burden of having to prove the truth, when lies are so much easier to whisper and believe. As I finished, someone from the board quietly asked Karen to respond. She started to explain, circling back to her earlier points, but the composure she'd always worn was crumbling. Her voice faltered. Several times she glanced at me, not with malice, but as if seeing a stranger. I almost pitied her when the questioning grew more pointed, when emails were matched with log evidence, when video security footage from late-night computer lab sessions was referenced. Karen's answers grew evasive. Facts she'd been so sure about at the start now slid away from her. She admitted to accessing my files to help with paperwork, but could not explain the altered content. The more the board dove in, the less plausible her story became. While the meeting continued for hours, I felt every minute settle onto my shoulders. I endured questions from faculty and staff, not just about evidence, but about my teaching methods, my work ethic, and even my personal resilience. Each answer was a line drawn between facts and rumors, between my hard-earned career and the quicksand I'd been thrown into. With every exchange, my confidence grew. The truth, broadcast for everyone to see, gave me back a piece of myself I'd thought lost for good. After a break, the board returned and deliberated behind closed doors. I sat outside the conference room, the faint sounds of muted debate pricking at my nerves. I pressed my hands into my knees, willing myself not to cry, to hold on to this last scrap of dignity, no matter the outcome. For the first time in months, I felt a fragile hope. Whatever happened next, I had spoken truth to power. I had not let bitterness or fear shape my words, only the clarity of what I'd lived through and what I wanted to reclaim. Eventually, the door opened. The board called us back in, Mrs. Randall's tone measured, but ever so slightly gentler than before. The findings were presented. The evidence was compelling, and the school would conduct a full investigation into the cybersecurity breaches and possible professional misconduct. Karen would be suspended pending further inquiry. As for me, my record would be cleared, and my teaching assignments would resume until the end of the year. The verdict slid over me like a sudden summer rain, a wash of relief tangled with deep exhaustion. Around the table, some of my colleagues looked relieved, others bewildered, a few contrite. One of the board members nodded at me, a gesture that said more than words. I gathered my papers and stood, hands still shaking, but for the first time, they trembled with relief, not fear. Outside the conference room, I leaned against the hallway wall, heart pounding, and let years of hurt trickle away. I had never wanted to win, only to be seen, to be heard, to reclaim the person I was before doubt and betrayal took root. I walked down the empty hallway, sunlight streaming through the windows and catching the dust motes floating in the air. I could breathe again. The truth was out there, and though it would take time for all the damage to heal, I had taken the hardest steps. I had faced my accuser, defended my name, and found the strength to stand up, not only for myself, but for anyone who'd ever been wronged by those they trusted most. The outcome and its impact. When the dust of the board meeting finally began to settle, I found myself alone in my classroom, surrounded by the quiet hum of the school's aging ventilation system and the soft tap of my fingertips against my desk. The official verdict still rang in my ears. Suspension for Karen, pending a full investigation, and my record cleared, my position reinstated. Yet, for all the procedural fanfare, what followed in the days and weeks ahead felt anything but simple. This was more than professional vindication. It was a tectonic shift in my relationships, my sense of safety, and my understanding of who I'd become through adversity. The first, most immediate feeling was almost animalistic, pure, messy relief. There was no dramatic scene or cheering. Instead, my body just slumped, every muscle suddenly aware of weeks spent in tension. Walking down Maplewoods halls, I felt the usual parade of student chatter and sneaker squeaks fade into a quiet white noise. I smiled at colleagues out of habit, but our interactions had taken on new, fragile layers. Now, when someone made small talk or offered congratulations, I sensed a cautious curiosity behind their words, mingled sympathies, some awkward admiration, and, from a few, the uncomfortable realization that they had once silently doubted me. I wish I could say that the world righted itself overnight, but in truth, vindication's aftertaste is bittersweet. Clearing my name had not erased the memory of betrayal, nor had it healed the subtle wounds left by gossip, suspicion, and the temporary loss of my community's trust. Some friends rallied back to my side with open arms and apologetic tears. Others, those who'd most vocally distanced themselves when things were uncertain, remained polite but distant, their loyalties forever reconfigured by invisible fault lines. The students, however, were a different story. Kids are astute observers. They notice the shift in a teacher's mood, the crinkles of exhaustion beneath tired eyes. In the first few days after my return, a handful approached timidly at lunch, offering shy smiles or paper cranes scribbled with, "Welcome back." One student, Lily, left a sticky note on my whiteboard. "We missed your laugh." It was in these small acts that the intangible toll of everything became achingly clear. The classroom had lost some of its lightness. Trust felt thinner and more tentative than before. I did my best to restore normalcy. I threw myself into lesson planning, crafted new reading activities, and encouraged more group work, hoping perhaps that shared stories and laughter could slowly stitch us back together. Over time, the tension faded, replaced by careful optimism. I learned not to flinch at whispered conversations or side eyes in the faculty lounge. If anything, I became more determined to be openly honest, documenting interactions, clarifying my methods, sometimes even explaining administrative procedures to students to foster transparency. Yet the real transformation was internal. For better or worse, the ordeal had forced me to confront limitations in my own resilience. There were sleepless nights haunted by phantom criticisms, days when a coworker's hesitancy set my heart racing. I had to reckon with a new question. How do you rebuild both trust and a sense of belonging after such a rupture? Funny how the mind works. I'd always idealized the teaching profession as a kind of calling, a noble community. But this experience revealed the shadows lurking in tight-knit spaces. Ego, competition, deeply personal stakes disguised in the minutiae of lesson plans and performance reviews. I recognized, with an almost clinical clarity, how rumors gain traction, not from facts, but from the vacuum of uncertainty and fear. If it happened to me, I reasoned, it could happen to any of us. That realization was oddly empowering. I felt a strange kinship with others who had ever been forced to defend their character against invisible attacks. My empathy for students struggling with exclusion or misrepresentation grew tenfold. My relationship with authority, and with Karen, could never return to what it was. During her suspension, she never reached out. I found myself imagining dozens of conversations, angry confrontations, teary apologies, awkward silences. None of them came true. Friends asked if I'd press charges or demand her firing, but deep down, vengeance felt empty. What I wanted wasn't retribution. It was acknowledgement, understanding, and perhaps even a path to forgiveness, one that could only be walked from afar. The administration's formal apology landed awkwardly, a letter of exoneration, an assurance of future robust protocols, and a gift card to a local restaurant. My principal, Mrs. Randall, met with me privately to commend my composure. I listened politely, still feeling the hollowness that comes with surviving a storm, but knowing you can never retrieve what was lost or undo what had been said behind closed doors. The teacher I had been before, the one who trusted without reservation, felt gone forever, and in her place stood someone older, warier, but also fiercely protective of her worth. News of the investigation and its outcome traveled quickly, as it always does in a small district. Some staff, who had kept their silence, confessed their doubts in hushed tones, apologizing for their inaction. A few younger colleagues approached me for advice, suddenly aware of how easily careers could pivot on a whisper. I became an unofficial mentor for those uneasy with the politics of teaching, parsing their concerns, sharing my story, and reminding them that quietly gathering facts and shielding your joy are survival skills, as vital as any rubric or curriculum map. Over the months, the board concluded its inquiry, and though Karen never returned to Maplewood, the shadow of what happened lingered. Staff meetings became more transparent. Digital audit trails were introduced, and the whistleblower policy gained real teeth. It was odd, almost surreal, to see tangible changes take root, procedures and protocols designed to prevent future betrayals inspired by my story. At times, I felt pride. At others, I wondered what the cost had been, not just for me, but for the fragile bonds that held our school together. Home life, too, was altered by the experience. My parents drove up to visit, their fierce pride laced with worry. Over home-cooked dinners, I struggled to explain both the relief and the grief. The sense of justice won, but at a price. Friends in other states shared their own tales of school politics gone awry, and I realized that what had happened at Maplewood was not unique, but part of a broader, sometimes painful, reality in communities built on close relationships and mutual trust. As graduation approached, I was officially offered the department chair position. The irony wasn't lost on me. What I'd once coveted as a badge of respect felt now like a testament to survival. I accepted, but with less outward joy and more careful resolve. I set about redefining what leadership could mean, determined to use my experience as a blueprint for fostering transparency, honest communication, and above all, a more compassionate support system for both teachers and students. The longer-term effects were subtle, sometimes invisible, but always present. I caught myself vetting new friendships more carefully, holding certain details back until trust was earned over time. Yet I was also braver in standing up for others. When a fellow teacher faced an unfair rumor, I was the first to set the record straight, sometimes ruffling feathers with my bluntness. I couldn't bear the thought of someone else walking the path I had, isolated, unseen, forced to prove their own innocence with forensic precision. Every so often, I'd run into a student in town, now graduated, who would thank me for a kind word or a nudge toward their goals. They rarely mentioned the tumult of that dark year. If anything, their gratitude reminded me that, while professional politics can wound, the heart of teaching is resilient. My classroom once again filled with the buzz of discussion and the gentle chaos of learning in progress. Some days, the past resurfaced in a lingering ache, but more often than not, it was the future that called to me, demanding courage, empathy, and an unwavering belief in the value of truth. I often reflect on the duality of my experience, the pain of betrayal set against the gift of clarity. I learned the hard way that survival isn't about erasing scars. It's about integrating them, letting them form the contours of a wiser, more grounded self. In some ways, the ordeal made me the kind of teacher and person I'd always hoped to be, not just competent, but deeply aware and endlessly compassionate. So much changed in those months, and yet the essence of why I teach remained. Now, when a new teacher joins Maplewood, or when a student nervously hands me a draft essay, I am quick to offer the benefit of the doubt, a belief in their goodness that once defined my own worldview. I can't guarantee a future free from disappointment or conflict, but I am living proof that even after the foundations of your life have been shaken, you can rebuild, stronger, wiser, and unashamedly yourself. The outcome was more than just administrative. It was deeply personal, a transformation marked by loss, resilience, and ultimately the quiet triumph of having faced down a crisis and emerged, not unscathed, but undeniably alive. The legacy of the investigation endures, not just in Maplewood's bylaws, but in the way I greet each day, with a measure of caution and a heart still open to possibility. Lessons learned, and the road ahead. When I think back on everything I experienced, the whisper campaigns, the breaking of trust, the dark uncertainty, and finally the grueling path of clearing my name, I find it tempting to tie it all up with a neat little bow, to tell myself, and anyone listening, that I learned a clear lesson and moved on. Simple as that. But real life is rarely so tidy. Instead, what I carry forward is something messier, but I'd argue infinitely more valuable, a collection of hard-won truths and a resilience I didn't know I had. Maybe it sounds strange, but the deepest lessons weren't about other people nearly so much as they were about myself. For a long time, I defined my sense of self through the opinions and approval of others. My students, my colleagues, my friends, my administrators. When that was ripped away and my reputation sat in the hands of people who barely knew the real me, the foundation I'd built everything on seemed to crumble. I spent many nights revisiting conversations, wondering how much I could have done differently, if I had been less trusting, more guarded, or perhaps more strategic. But eventually, I realized that there's a strength in living authentically, even, maybe especially, when that opens you up to risk. One of the first lessons I clung to is this: we rarely discover our true character until our backs are against the wall. Before the betrayal, I'd seen courage as something loud and dramatic. I know now it's often quiet. The way you hold your head up and do your job while rumors swirl. The way you show up for your students when your own heart is breaking. I developed a new, almost fierce compassion for anyone who's ever been misunderstood, scapegoated, or cast in the role of problem, simply because it was convenient for someone else. That empathy has reshaped the way I teach, and frankly, the way I move through the rest of my life. Another truth, and not an easy one: healing is not linear. There were days when I felt vindicated and strong, and others when a sideways glance or an innocent joke would send my stomach lurching all over again. Picking up the pieces after a public ordeal, especially one as personal as this, means learning to be patient and gentle with yourself, over and over. Some wounds close up quickly on the surface, but ache below for a long, long time. Professionally, my standards for friendship and trust have changed. Not in the sense that I've become jaded or bitter, though I had to pass through those stages, but that I pay far more attention to actions, not just words. I've learned to build boundaries, not walls, but thoughtful lines that protect my peace. It's made my relationships with students stronger too, oddly enough. They sense when you're genuine. And having walked through a storm, I'm better at noticing when someone else is too. There's something else. I stopped waiting for the system to protect me. Transparency and due process matter, but institutions are, in the end, collections of human beings, just as fallible, just as prone to fear or bias or looking out for their own interests. I still love my school. I still believe in its mission, but I no longer place blind faith in any organization, however noble. I document my work. I mentor new teachers and share my experience, not to scare them, but to prepare them for the complicated reality of working in a community. I set an example of speaking up, not just when it's popular or easy, but when it's necessary. Personally, I let go of the version of myself that needs to be universally liked. I've become comfortable with the idea that living by my values, leading with honesty, refusing to play politics, giving others the benefit of the doubt where it's earned, sometimes means being misunderstood or even resented. There is a strange kind of peace that comes from not constantly trying to manage other people's opinions. I hold those I trust close, but I don't rely on their validation to define who I am. Most of all, though, this chapter taught me that surviving hardship does not mean you come out unchanged. That's impossible. You emerge with scars, sure, but also with wisdom and a kind of stubborn hope. I remind myself, and others, that there is no shame in vulnerability. In a profession where every day is a mixture of chaos and heart, to keep caring, to keep showing up, is an act of quiet bravery. As I look down the road ahead, I can honestly say, I am not afraid anymore. I know there will be conflicts, disappointments, days when the burden feels too heavy. But I also know that I am stronger than I thought. My courage is not a shield that keeps pain away, but a well I draw from in order to keep going, to keep teaching, mentoring, and loving, even when it might hurt. To anyone who finds themselves in a similar storm, wondering if they have the strength to withstand it, my lived experience is this: you do. It won't be easy, but you will wake up one day and realize you are not just surviving. You are living, perhaps more deeply and honestly than before. Every difficult step is part of your story, and if you let those scars remind you of your own resilience, they will become anchors, not weights, as you keep moving forward. The road ahead is, as ever, uncertain, but with my feet planted firmly, my boundaries clear, and my heart, though battered, still open, I step forward, determined to live, to serve, and to trust again, one thoughtful act at a time.